Okay, time for us to begin. We're ready for our class on Tychicus, the traveling companion of Paul. And you'll certainly be forgiven if you pronounce that otherwise. Yeah. But the typical English pronunciation that I've heard is Tychicus, but if you were a Greek speaker from the first century, you'd probably say it a little differently. But Chris and I are going to try to stick to Tychicus. You may know that my grandfather is a preacher, and I'll tell you this since we're on this minor character class. One time I remember going to hear him speak in a lectureship on minor characters in the New Testament. I don't know if he'd like me telling this, but anyway, he's a great person, but he was assigned to speak on Epaphroditus, and I'll never forget as a kid hearing him preach and pronouncing that about 8 different ways during the course of the sermon. It was Epaphroditus, Epaphras, Epaphroditus, and occasionally he would say Epaphroditus, but only about a third of the time. So anyway, some of these characters have names that can be challenging when we're not typical Greek speakers. Okay, Chris, is it okay if we do our quiz?
Let's quiz them.
Okay. In what book of the Bible is Chloe mentioned? Would that be Romans, 1 Corinthians, Ephesians, or Acts? Which one would that be? Okay, now remember the message that Chloe gave to Paul was about what? It was about division.
1 Corinthians.
Where?
1 Corinthians.
In Corinth. So that's in 1 Corinthians. Some of you may be getting confused with Phoebe because Phoebe is in Romans 16 and we covered Phoebe the week before. Okay, number 2, true or false? Paul directly commended Chloe's character. Is that true or false? Did he do that? And now remember what I'm asking is, did he directly commend? So that would mean there would have to be a statement such as a commendation. He would have to say something about how good their character was or something like that. Did he do that? No, he didn't do that. That's false. So we gave some speculation about whether they might have been good. Maybe they were Christians. Maybe they weren't Christians. There's something good we can say about what they did, but Paul does not directly commend their character. Number 3, what did Chloe's people do according to 1 Corinthians 1:11? We've already sort of said it, but what are they noted for doing? In your own words, just what did they do? There's really only one thing they did.
He said
Right.
gave a report.
They gave a report to Paul about what? Yeah, the division in the church at Corinth. So that's where Paul got his information. Good. Number 4, did Chloe's people gossip, that is sin? If they gossiped, they sinned, didn't they? So did they sin in reporting the Corinthians' conflict to Paul? Why or why not? Say again? They did not. Now, why would you say they did not? Right. Yeah. Right. There's no indication that they were doing this for anything other than a pure motive. And Paul doesn't say they shouldn't have done this. Paul uses the information to accomplish a good purpose. So it would seem that they passed the information along to Paul because they were in some way concerned about the problem that was going on. So this was not gossip, which we discussed gossip a little bit last week, and we talked about how it always involves negative opposition to the person you're gossiping about. It is careless mistreatment of a person by spreading things around. But there are times when we have to reveal negative information to an appropriate party so that the person can be helped. If someone, for example, confides in me that they're thinking about committing suicide, and they didn't want me to tell anybody, well, I need to tell somebody. I need to tell the person who can help them reshift their thinking and so forth. We could give other examples. The elders need to talk about problems that are going on in people's lives so that they can help them avoid sin and get out of sin and so forth. So this was an effort, it seems, to get the Corinthians out of their sin. Wouldn't you say that, Chris?
Yeah, and it was true. You know,
Right,
so,
gossip often isn't true.
Right. It was
Right.
true. It was already well known. I mean, from Paul's writing, you could tell it was well known. And like I said, they had good intentions in trying to resolve this issue. At least it seems they did.
Mm-hmm. Right. Last one, 1 Corinthians 1:14. I thank God that I baptized none of you except blank and blank, so that no one would say you were baptized in my name. Who were those two men? Okay, say it loudly where we can hear. Well, now this is Paul writing. Crispus and Gaius. Very good. And we need to remember that here Paul is emphasizing not the insignificance of baptism, because it's essential for salvation, and he taught that in various passages. But rather what he's emphasizing here is that the identity of the baptizer is inessential. It's really inconsequential, as long as the one who is being baptized is doing so for the right reason. And Paul here says, I'm glad I didn't baptize with my own hands more people, because then, given the character of the church at Corinth and the way they were acting, they might be saying, well, I was baptized in Paul's name. And he didn't want anybody saying that, because there's only one name into which we're baptized, and that's the name of God, the Father, Son, and Spirit. Okay, here are our texts on Tychicus. And Chris, maybe I would just ask you to give us a brief introduction to who Tychicus was, and then we can just walk through these various passages. But what comes to your mind when I say the name Tychicus?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is I guess his connection with Paul. Obviously, from our text, you can see that it was Paul mainly writing about him. Luke, we would say in Acts 20, wrote about him. But that's again with connection with Paul. He was a faithful traveling companion of Paul's, and as we'll go through, I don't want to reveal too much. I guess as we go, we can reveal it as we go. But he seemed to be someone that Paul trusted with important matters, very important matters. He seems to be a very reliable person. There's some that we can look into, and I guess we can talk about this in an introductory way. Some seem to think that maybe he was himself at one time a slave. The name Tychicus, apparently, from people who know more than I do, say that was a very common slave name in Rome, and that might, when we look later on in some of the things with Philemon maybe and Onesimus mentioned with Tychicus as well, and we know Onesimus was a slave, and maybe they had a connection there. But either way, he ends up in Paul's traveling and in his missionary journeys. I don't know if we know whether it was Paul that led him to the gospel. I don't know that it says in what we looked at. But he ends up obeying the gospel, and he's a Christian, and he's someone that sticks by Paul's side, and is traveling with Paul, and Paul is putting him to work.
That's right. Very good. So let's turn to Acts chapter 20 and verse 4 and see, and maybe we should read more than just 4, although that's the passage where he's mentioned.
Yeah, so in Acts 20, Paul has departed from Macedonia. It says he came to Greece in verse 2 in Acts chapter 20. And there he spent 3 months. And when a plot was made against him by the Jews, as he was about to set sail for Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. And so here we have some more names. I guess I should let Caleb take over here.
No.
Sopater?
I've always heard Sopater, but
Sopater.
I could be wrong.
Well, let's go with that. The Berean, son of Pyrrhus, accompanied him, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and the Asians, Tychicus, and Trophimus. So it says, these went on ahead and were waiting for us at Troas, but we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days we came to them at Troas, where we stayed for 7 days. So here, very little said about Tychicus here in Acts chapter 20, other than he was in this group, again, that had been accompanied Paul or had been with Paul, and he was in there with people such as Timothy, Gaius, who was, I guess it's the same Gaius that was maybe mentioned by Paul.
Could be.
That he baptized, going back to what he said about 1 Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians. So he is in this group that has been traveling with Paul, and it says, and the Asians. So that gives us a little bit maybe more information on where he was from. Asian doesn't necessarily in this sense mean what maybe we think of Asia in that time. I guess could have been maybe more Asia Minor, Turkey maybe, that area. Not so much maybe thinking of China or over in that area. But it gives, again, where he's from here, and that gives us a little bit more background information on him.
And he would have been there in this assembly at Troas when the Christians gathered on the first day of the week to have the Lord's Supper. And also this occasion when Eutychus fell out of the window, and so Tychicus would have seen Paul resurrect Eutychus from the dead. So he had some experience with the apostles' miracles here if he hadn't already seen it, and surely he had. Surely if he's traveling with Paul, he had the apostles' hands laid on him so that he would have the miraculous abilities. Paul would want his messengers, that is, those who were traveling and sent by him, as we're going to see Tychicus sent by Paul to Ephesus and Colossae in the epistles that we'll see in just a minute, as the messengers who would take that letter. They would want Tychicus to be able to perform miraculous works by the power of God to verify his authority, in addition to the letter that he had. So Tychicus was well initiated into the ministry of Paul.
Yeah, and his closeness to Paul is something that we're going to emphasize as well. And to think of what all he saw as a traveling companion of Paul. And that's going to be important, that he was here for these important events that were happening. He was here when things weren't going well necessarily for Paul. And you think of all the places he's just been run out of. And essentially, being run out of Philippi and run out of Macedonia. Now he's going back to Macedonia. And Tychicus was there for a lot of it. He was, when we think of traveling companions of Paul, we think of people like who? Who are some of the ones we normally think of? Silas, especially after Barnabas and Paul kind of separated and went their own ways, he picked up Silas. Who else? Timothy. Timothy is another one. And we think of how close Timothy was to Paul. Well, Tychicus was right here in this. He was also, no, we don't have a letter written to him, but these letters that we do have, we're about to see how Tychicus is connected to all these writings that we have of Paul's that are preserved for us today, that we have the copies of those today, but he was there and involved in that process.
Right, and he's mentioned, if we look down to 2 Timothy 4:11 and 12, and we'll get there to discuss it a little bit more, but he says, only Luke is with me. To Timothy, he says, pick up Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for service. But Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus. So here Paul says, and this is in the second imprisonment, so this is years after he wrote Ephesians and sent Tychicus to Ephesus that time. But now he's going to send him back to Ephesus. And so at the time when Luke was with Paul in Rome in this second imprisonment, and it was only Luke, it was also Tychicus, because Tychicus was sent. It seems they were both there together. So it was Paul and Luke and Tychicus, and then it was just Luke after he had sent Tychicus to Ephesus. So we say that because you're talking about Paul's sort of inner circle of his traveling companions. Well, Luke and Tychicus were among the very closest to him.
Yeah, and I would say we have it's believed, that Luke received a lot of his understanding and his teaching that he wrote about from Paul in his time that was spent with Paul, and obviously Peter and others and other maybe firsthand accounts that he was getting from that and his writing. So that was a lot of what Luke did. That seems to be, he was with Paul a lot, and he was writing that. We're going to see that Tychicus was sent a lot, and he would maybe take these writings that maybe Luke could have been writing, and Paul would put his signature on it. As you said, he would say, look at this writing. You can tell this is my handwriting here at the end. I'm putting my signature on this so you know it's for me. It's interesting when you study those ancient history, when a letter was sent, it was an expensive thing to undertake. To be able to write a letter and send it, it's not as easy as it is today. You can't just pick up, a piece of paper, from your bookshelf or whatever, and just easily write it out, slap a stamp on it, put an envelope, put a stamp on it, and send it off. No, it was a very expensive undertaking, especially the longer a writing was. It can become very expensive. And then when you sent it, sometimes you might run into a situation where someone couldn't read what you were sending. And so a lot of servants were trained in how to read. And so when you sent a letter, a lot of times it was sent by these servants who were trained in how to read, so when they got there, they could read the letter to them. So maybe Tychicus wasn't the one writing, but his work was very important. And that maybe goes back to him being a slave or a servant and being trained in how to read. So when he got there, he could read the letters to these people. So again, going back to Ephesus, being sent maybe because they need something read to them. And how important was that, to have someone who could come in and read those if there were people in the congregation who couldn't read themselves?
And that would apply to the letter to the Laodiceans, which is mentioned in Ephesians as being a letter that needed to be shared with the church at Ephesus, and Ephesians needed to be shared with the Laodiceans. And so it may be that Tychicus was the one who was making sure all of that happened. We should ask ourselves this practical question, and you may think to yourself, well, I'm not Paul's amanuensis or secretary. I'm not Paul's delivery person. So what does this have to do with me? Each of us is entrusted with the letter to the Ephesians just as surely as Tychicus was, or Colossians, or Philemon. It seems he was the delivery person for all of those. But we need to ask ourselves, have we allowed Tychicus's delivery to reach us? Are we ingesting these letters into our own lives? But then, are we delivering it to other people? Because Paul's intent is not just that those letters be read to those early congregations in the first century, but also that they be read by people today and properly applied to our lives, just as surely as they needed to know the letters. So that's a question for each of us. How are we treating these holy documents? Can you imagine the care with which Tychicus kept these scrolls as he was traveling with them to make sure nothing happened to them, to make sure that they didn't get smudged or torn or lost or broken one way or the other, but that he said, I'm going to take this scroll that's so precious, so expensive to make, hundreds of and thousands of dollars if you study ancient letter writing. As Chris is saying, a very expensive process. And not only expensive in money, but expensive in hours, as they probably made several copies. But not only precious in that sense, but precious in that it was inspired writing, and there were only relatively few of these books then and now that are available. So Tychicus says, I'm holding this scroll that's in a very real sense from heaven, and I've got to make sure it gets to its proper destination.
And you think of the situation that he was in. You think of the hostility that was, we'll get to in a minute, George, I didn't know you had the microphone. The hostility towards Paul and his traveling companions at this time. And not only thinking, well, I want to protect this document and keep it from getting torn or smudged or anything like that, so it can be clearly read when I get there, and so it can be clearly read for a long time. But thinking, there's robbers. I'm walking and carrying this document, and maybe he had his own some traveling companions that went with him, maybe even in form of protection or whatever. But thinking that there's people out here, if they know I'm taking these documents to other people, they're going to want to take them and destroy them. And so trying to be careful of and it's just, you just think of the preservation of God's word, and as Caleb was saying, the care for it, the care that Tychicus had to have for God's word, and the love that he had to have for it, and the dedication to being that person who's preserving it and reading it to others. And that's such a wonderful thing to be able to do that. I remember when my grandmother was sick and in the hospital, and she couldn't, she couldn't read and see very well. And one of my things I'd do when I'd visit her was I'd open up the Bible and I'd read to her. And she always appreciated that. And just to think of that, maybe I'm not the person who can just get up and write a book, or I'm not the person who can, give a great speech. But you can read God's word, can't you? I mean, most of us, I would think, can read God's word and share that precious message with those who are willing to listen. And isn't it great that just those written words and the words that when we read it, how powerful they are to save souls and to bring people to the knowledge of the truth, and to think that we can carry that around today and carry it to people and read it to them even. It's just a wonderful thought.
Paul highlights Alexander the coppersmith in 2 Timothy 4:14 just after he mentions Tychicus, and it says, Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm. May the Lord repay him according to his deeds. And that makes me think, where is Alexander the coppersmith? We don't know where he resided, but is it possible that he was part of the crowd at Ephesus that was trying to get Paul in trouble? I mean, Demetrius is the one who's highlighted, but if you've got a silversmith, why couldn't you have a coppersmith there too? And so it's quite possible he was there, and that's where Tychicus was going. And a lot of people speculate that Alexander was the one who got Paul in prison the second time. Why would Paul highlight just him unless he had done something very notable to Paul? So that's speculation, but I bring that up because there were people out there like that who, if they could stifle Paul's words from getting into the hands of the people who needed them, they would stop it.
And they would be viewing it as too like propaganda,
right?
And you think about some of the ways Christians are treated and the Bible is held today. People almost view that, the teaching of the Scriptures as a type of propaganda or something, and trying to keep it away from people and keep people from hearing it and listening to it. And as you said, Alexander the coppersmith was probably right there in that group and trying to cause an uproar, as was in Ephesus and other places. When Paul would visit, they would try to cause an uproar and get people to reject Christianity and not listen to it.
Oh, the writings of Paul are so much derided in our contemporary society, mainly because of the things that Paul says about certain sins in 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 11, but also what he says about the role of women, the fact that Paul recognizes gender distinctive roles in the epistles to Timothy is thought to be something that contemporary society would just deride and make fun of and say is backwards. So there are many people today who are in the same way, much that Alexander the coppersmith was trying to keep people from Paul. There are a lot of people today who are saying, well, don't listen to Paul. He's backward. He's old-fashioned. He tries to keep women from taking leadership and things like this. So he hated women, and they say Jesus and Paul are on two different pages. If you want Christianity, you want Jesus. You don't want Paul, this type of thing. But that's not Tychicus's perspective, is it?
No. And in his close relationship with Paul, and as we see, I think as we look at some of these other passages, he knew Paul, and he knew Paul personally, and he could relate to people what was going on in Paul's life, and if they had questions about, Paul wrote this, but did he really mean something else? Or and you think of Paul defending his apostleship, and some people would say, well, he's weighty, or he's very bold in his writings, but when he gets here in person, he's not going to be that way. And Tychicus could say, hey, I know Paul, and he will stand up for the truth to your face. Maybe, I don't know if he was there when Paul stood up to Peter. I mean, I guess Paul hadn't got to that point yet in his traveling, so he probably wasn't there.
That was earlier, yeah.
But he probably talked to people who were there when Paul withstood Peter to his face in Antioch, and when he got up from the table from where the Gentiles were at, and we read about that some too in Galatians chapter 2. Paul was talking about that and how he withstood Peter to his face. And so Tychicus could say, like, no, when he writes this, he means it. He's not just being bold because he's writing and not speaking to your face. He will back those words up when he gets here.
Before we get to George's comment, let's go ahead and read Ephesians 6, and that because we've mentioned this passage a couple times already, and so we'll have more of the Bible out there before we go much further. But let's read verses, since Chris has brought up Paul's boldness and Tychicus's ability to vouch for that. Let's read beginning in verse 18. With all prayer and petition, Paul says, pray at all times in the Spirit. There's inspired prayer in the first century. I mean, would we allow people to lead the prayer here at Lakeside who had never had a copy of the New Testament? I don't think we would, because they wouldn't be properly informed about how to pray. But they had inspired prayer, just like they had inspired preaching in the first century. Pray at all times in the Spirit. And with this in view, be on the alert, with all perseverance and petition for all the saints, and pray on my behalf that utterance may be given to me in the opening of my mouth, to make known with boldness the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains. There's one of the passages that tells us that this is a prison epistle, one of the 4 epistles Paul wrote during his first imprisonment. That those are Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. And interestingly, Tychicus is mentioned in 3 out of those 4. So that shows us very clearly he was in the prison experience with Paul. Verse 21 now, but that you also may know about my circumstances, how I am doing, Tychicus, the beloved brother, here's a great description, and faithful minister in the Lord, will make everything known to you. I have sent him to you for this very purpose, so that you may know about us, and that he may comfort your hearts. Now, just pause there and think about the purpose of Ephesians. Some people have said, well, Ephesians is purely a circular letter. That is, it's sent to Ephesus, but it's really for all the churches in the area and not Ephesus in particular. And we know that, they say, because there's not much personal material in the book of Ephesians. It's about exalting Christ in the church, and it doesn't have a lot of greeting or naming of people in Ephesus and things like that. So there's not much personal affectation in the book. Well, just because there aren't a lot of mentionings of people's names, that doesn't mean it's impersonal. Why? Because Tychicus is bringing the letter. So what does Paul say about him? He says, he will make everything known to you. He will tell you about my circumstances. So any questions you have about me personally, he's there to answer. So Paul doesn't have to spend a lot of time on the other things. In fact, could Paul write down a list of people, much like is in Romans 16, where Paul gives a list of people who he wants to greet? Could he have written down a list and handed it to Tychicus and said, now when you get to Ephesus, make sure you greet these people? Well, sure. So just because it's a circular letter doesn't mean we should act as though it's impersonal. Sometimes we make judgments about Bible books that really doesn't consider the circumstance that would have been involved. Okay, George?
Perhaps Tychicus had a special talent that in those days was very important. And until recently it was very important, but it's not now. When Betty was teaching early in the 60s, she taught 1st and 2nd grade. She was teaching those kids how to write. She spent an enormous amount of time teaching those kids to write their letters almost perfectly so that someone else could understand what they were writing. And I'm sure there were certain people in those days that if you were sending letters or something that everybody should read, you wanted it to be legible so they could read. And perhaps he had that talent, just like Luke did.
Right. If Paul had an eyesight problem, as some people think he did, maybe it seems that he had some eyesight issue perhaps, then Tychicus may have been one of those people who made it legible, who wrote it down for Paul.
Yeah, and in identifying what was truly a letter from Paul, because as we've mentioned, Paul would, put kind of his signature on it and saying, "This is from me." Well, there's a reason for that, because there were others, who were writing and saying, "Well, if we can convince the people that Paul actually believes something else, let's do that." And so we'll write a letter and we'll say it's from Paul. Well, Tychicus was a traveling companion of Paul. He could say, like, "No, that's not his signature. That's not from Paul. Like, look, this is from Paul. I just came from Paul." And so he could be that person who would identify as well and saying, "No, this is from a false apostle. This is not an inspired writing." And so you need to set that aside and let's look at this. This is from Paul. And, I can testify to that.
And Paul's identification of people who were known to Christians in the region is part of the indication of the truthfulness of the epistle, because Paul would send the letter with people who were known there and who could, as Chris is saying, verify for what Paul was doing, so that there would be no question as to the authenticity of the letter. Notice, I'm going to give you some references here, and you can just write them down if you want to, but here are the places where Paul mentions writing something in his own hand. 1 Corinthians 16:21, Galatians 6:11, where that's the place where he said he wrote with large letters, and that's an indication that maybe Paul had to write with large letters so he could see them. So he says, "This, this is from me because I'm writing this part in these big letters." Colossians 4:18, 2 Thessalonians 3:17. This is where he says he wrote it in his own hand, and this is a distinguishing mark in every letter. This is the way I write. Think about that. This is what Chris is saying. Here's the distinction between false letters, and we know there were false apostles, people who were saying they were speaking for God and opposing what Paul was saying. So here he says, "I'm writing this in my own hand," and you can tell that it's in my own hand. This is the way I sign all my letters. So if it's not signed this way, it's not authentic. Then Philemon 1:19, "I, Paul, am writing this with my own hand." So there's an indication. And Tychicus would be highlighting that for these people, saying, "This is really from Paul. I know Paul. I'm bringing it. I'm an eyewitness of the writing of this letter, and this is the signature that he uses to sign all of his letters."
And it wasn't, and I don't think it's, I was just thinking of this. Sorry. Many of those, when he's writing that, not all of them, I don't think, but many of those, remember, he was in chains. Mm-hmm. Think of how hard it is to write, especially a long letter if you are in chains. And especially some of those had to do with the prison epistles that he was writing. And so maybe at those times he could say, here, while I'm in chains, I can put my signature on this. I can write and write part of this, but I am in chains. I'm locked up. I can't just take off, and even if I had the ability or the eyesight to do it, it's going to be very hard for me to write that right now.
And imagine the comfort that a beloved brother and a faithful servant like Tychicus would be to Paul while he was in prison. When we remember what Jesus says in Matthew 25, when he paints the picture of the judgment day and says, "I was in prison and what? I was in prison and you visited me." Mm-hmm. And now here Paul is in prison, which must have seemed very ironic to him that he used to be the one imprisoning the Christians, and now he's the Christian who's imprisoned. And he's very thankful to have Tychicus. We know it mattered to Paul that he had somebody with him, because in 2 Timothy 4:16? 2 Timothy 4:16, he says, "At my first defense before Caesar, no one stood with me." That's one of the reasons we know that this is a second imprisonment, is he talks about the first time he appeared before Caesar and says, "No one stood with me, but the Lord stood with me." So the Lord is always with him. But even though the Lord is always with us, doesn't it matter that humans are with us? We know that matters to God, because he didn't make us Christians in isolation. It would have been perfectly easy and legitimate for God to say, "Okay, you're a Christian, now go live the Christian life by yourself. Be shut up in a monastery or something and never talk to anybody." But that's not the way Christianity was arranged. God said, be in a family of believers who support one another. So we need the human support. And Paul recognized that, and he says, "This is my beloved brother and faithful servant." That means a lot when you talk about somebody who was in a 2-year imprisonment in Rome the first time. And then in 2 Timothy, we don't know exactly how long the second imprisonment was. But can you imagine being under house arrest? And that's essentially what it was. He had his own rented house, but he couldn't go. He couldn't leave Rome. At times couldn't even leave his house. In Acts 28, we read about that. And so I've never been in a circumstance like that where I'm shut up in a place and can't go anywhere. I'm allowed to receive visitors. Paul was allowed to receive visitors, so he evangelized that way, but he wasn't allowed to leave. It's almost like he's on probation after having committed some grievous crime. Really, he was just awaiting his trial, but it would mean a lot to have somebody there to comfort you during those times. We should take a lesson from that. Whenever we have Christians who are shut in for some reason, not prison necessarily, but just they can't go, then won't it mean something to them to have someone visit them? Have you ever visited someone who was shut in and you noticed that the person couldn't stop talking? And what does that mean? That means they have a lot of things bottled up that they can't tell anybody. And then as soon as they get the opportunity to tell somebody, it just all flows out. And it's good. It's cathartic, I'm sure, for them to have that opportunity. But shouldn't we give them lovingly the opportunity to speak to somebody? That may occur especially in cases where you have an older person whose family is mostly gone, maybe mostly deceased, maybe doesn't live close by. They just don't have a lot of contact. I've heard of people calling the weather line on the telephone, or the time, you can call a number and they'll give you the correct time. They will call that number just to hear another human voice, but because they just don't have contact. And that's a tragic thing, isn't it? So we should try to help when people are shut in. That's one thing we learned from Tychicus.
Yeah. And looking at moving on, looking at Colossians, going on to Colossians chapter 4 and verse 7, and it's this same idea. Again, Paul is writing, he's sending this letter to him. He says this: Tychicus will tell you all about my activities. Again, he knows the intimate details. He knows exactly what's going on in my life. And so, again, we might look at Colossians and think it's very similar to Ephesians, and we might think, well, it's another one of those maybe letters that's not very personal in it. But again, he's sending Tychicus. Sorry. He knows all about my activities. He is a beloved brother and faithful minister and fellow servant in the Lord. I have sent him to you for this very purpose, that you may know how we are, and that he may encourage your hearts. And with him, Onesimus, our faithful and beloved brother, who is one of you. They will tell you of everything that has taken place here. And so again, here we have Tychicus and Onesimus traveling together. You will remember Onesimus from the book of Philemon, which I think Caleb has already brought up, and how Onesimus was the one who, again, was a servant of Philemon's, and he had ran away, and in his running away, he came in contact with Paul and was taught the gospel, and eventually Paul says, I'm sending Onesimus back to you, because we want to make sure everything is right. We want to make sure everything is good between you two. And he said about Onesimus that he is very, in words basically like this, that he's still very useful to me, that he has been helpful to me in my ministry. And here we see part of that he was traveling with Tychicus, and he was going with him in taking this. And the very purpose for him sending them was so that he could encourage their hearts again, that they could be encouraged by that.
And so he was a minister or an agent of reconciliation between these two. Okay, Chris, imagine if you're Philemon and I'm Tychicus and I've got Onesimus here with me, the person who ran away from you and under the ordinances of that time has cheated you out of a lot of service, and I bring you this letter, and this is going to be hard perhaps for you to read. If you're a Christian who is feeling like he's been defrauded, and Paul is going to say, forgive this person, take him back, treat him as your brother, that may be initially hard for me to hear. So what's the role of Tychicus? Isn't that going to be to try to smooth this over? Isn't it going to be to emphasize, as Philemon reads this letter and looks up at Tychicus and maybe with an angry face says, what is Paul doing? I don't know. We don't know how Philemon responded, do we? There's no indication in the Bible about how Philemon responded to the letter. But I can just imagine Tychicus being the one who says, now, let me talk to you about this. Now, look at how Paul is phrasing this. Let's think about what he says and how he appeals to you as a brother. And can you imagine Tychicus kind of calming him down? Not that Paul said anything other than exactly what he should have said. We're not minimizing Paul's role. We're just saying sometimes the messenger gets caught in the crossfire, and also the messenger can be the one to help smooth things over. So Paul had to pick a really special person to be the go-between here, because this is a letter that says, fix things. And it reminds me of Philippians at the beginning of chapter 3, right, when Paul talks about the ladies in the congregation, Euodia and Syntyche, who needed
the problems that they were causing.
They were having those problems in the church, and Paul's telling them, you know, you need to get things right between you and do the right thing. And there are times like that when Paul addresses specific individuals, but Philemon is rather in a class by itself, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Okay, then we have 2 Timothy 4:12. So let's read. We just don't have very much time, but we've talked generally about these passages. Let's look at 2 Timothy 4, verse 11. Only Luke is with me. Pick up Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for service. But Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus. Apparently that's where Timothy was. If you look at 1 Timothy 1:3, when Paul addressed the first letter to Timothy, he was the minister at Ephesus, which is neat because that's where Paul was the preacher formerly. Paul was the former, we might say, pulpit minister at Ephesus, and now Timothy is. And Paul sends the letter to Timothy there, and presumably Timothy's still there. We don't have any reason to think otherwise. So when Paul says, Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus, that means Tychicus is taking this very letter, 2 Timothy, to Ephesus. Don't have any reason to think otherwise. And then we have Titus 3:12. Let's look at Titus 3:12 so we can get all the verses in front of you. Okay, when I send Artemas or Tychicus, not sure which one he's going to send. When I send Artemas or Tychicus to you, make every effort to come to me at Nicopolis, for I have decided to spend the winter there. So we're not sure if he wound up sending one or the other. Maybe he wrote the letter before he had made a final decision about which one of these people was going to go. But if you put it all together, it may be that no fewer than 5 letters were delivered by this faithful person, Tychicus. So that raises the question, is there anybody in terms of delivery who did more to spread the word of God in the history of the church than Tychicus? It may be that there's nobody who did. Even though he didn't write very much, if any, of these words down and wasn't the official author on any of these books, nonetheless, he was there when they were written, and he was the one who delivered them. Okay, having said that, though, are we really fundamentally in any different position than Tychicus was? I wasn't there when Paul wrote this, but I'm entrusted with the message just as surely as Tychicus was. Mm-hmm. In fact, in a way, it's more somber and serious for me because I have so much more opportunity to share it. Tychicus had one scroll, and that was his charge, to get this scroll to the right place, explain it to the people, help them understand what was going on with Paul. He had a big job. But I have all the Bible every day of my life, which I'm charged with delivering to those over whom I have influence. That's true for every single person. So that's weighty, but it's also glorious because it's a greater opportunity than Tychicus ever had, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just wrapping this all up, you think of the great treasure that Tychicus was carrying about with him and how important that was, and that he was a person that could be trusted to take the gospel, to read it as it was, to explain it, and that he was just willing to serve. And again, mentioned over and over again, he's a faithful minister. He's a faithful servant. And he was just basically saying to Paul, we can think, you know, however you need to use me, use me. If you need me to go here, send me there. I'm willing to go. And how important is it just to have that quality for us as Christians, as being people who are just willing to go, whether it's go and serve, go and encourage, go and help, go and visit. That's such an important quality. And if we can all adopt that quality in our lives, just being that person that's willing to go, then we can do a lot of good, just like Tychicus did in his ministry and his work.
Very good. Thank you. We'll look forward to seeing everyone next week.